Coming up on Headline Humboldt, salmon season will almost certainly be limited or even closed this year, promising more hard times for an industry already hurting from a diminishing catch and burdensome regulation. We interview Ken Bates from the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association about wind power and the important work still being done by our region's fishing fleet. Coming up now on Headline Humboldt. From the top of Humboldt Hill, this is Headline Humboldt. I'm James Falk. Thanks for joining us. It's a deep and undeniable human trait, the need to live and serve a project much bigger than ourselves. The area fishing industry has long embraced that inkling and made it their life's work. Against the modern tide of increasing detachment from nature and easy digital convenience, those brave souls still plying this ancient industry on the North Coast put their lives at risk every time they cross the bar. They do it for work, for their livelihoods, for their families, and for the rest of us. They also do it for the honor of pursuing a deeply honorable tradition. And they do it amid what is absolutely the last great untamed realm on this earth, the vast and voracious wilderness of ocean that in so many ways we still barely understand. It's a deep part of who we are as a people on this isolated, rugged shoulder of North America, and a deep part of who and what we've been. These folks have lived, worked, struggled, and even died to pursue this calling. And how we honor that choice and elevate that service in the here and now says everything about who we are as a community. They're not asking to be saved. They're not asking for an easy handout. They're asking to have their lives and work protected and their way of life respected for what it provides all of us. Ken Bates from the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association will be here shortly to describe for us the important work these folks still do for our economy, for the good of the environment, and for the proud maintenance of tradition. But first, the news. After a complete ban on salmon fishing last year, the options now being considered by the Pacific Fishery Management Council would all continue similar limits into this upcoming salmon season. The Pacific Fishery Management Council today released a series of options, actually it was early this week, a series of options that are under consideration, all of which either ban commercial and recreational salmon fishing in the ocean off California or shorten the season and set strict catch limits. The Council's final decision is expected next month. The commercial season typically begins in May and ends in October. While more Chinook salmon returned from the ocean to spawn last year than in 2022, fishery managers maintain that the population is expected to be so small that they should be protected to avoid overfishing. Last year's closure cost roughly $45 million in lost revenue. The options are now being analyzed and may evolve as this process continues. Both the Yurok tribe and the Bear River Band of the Ronaville Rancheria in recent weeks have come out in opposition to the massive wind power project planned off the Humboldt County coast. The Humboldt Bay Harbor Conservation and Recreation District was awarded $426 million earlier this year to develop the land facilities on the Samoa Peninsula to make such an industry possible. While celebrated by some as a huge economic boost for the region, both tribes say not enough is known about the potential environmental impacts, and that such development could significantly damage sacred cultural sites. Quote, "It is the opinion of the Bear River Tribal Council that the effects of these offshore wind projects will be disastrous to the cultural and natural resources of all native territories in the area, and we seek unity amongst tribes to protect these things which we have been the protectors of since time immemorial," the Bear River Band said in a press release. In January, the Yurok tribe hosted a two-day offshore wind summit in Eureka. The summit featured presentations from West and East Coast tribal leaders, local and state and federal officials, and industry representatives. In part, the Tribal Council organized the meeting to hear from tribes on the East Coast where the offshore wind industry is further along in the development process. The East Coast tribes voiced grave concerns about developers' attempts to subvert laws that protect tribal lands and spiritual sites. Last month, the National Congress of American Indians, the largest national organization of tribal governments, issued a resolution asking the Biden administration to suspend all scoping and permitting of offshore wind projects until the completion of a comprehensive and transparent procedure adequately protecting tribal, environmental, and sovereign interests is developed and implemented. The Yurok Tribal Council has said it will soon issue a resolution on the tribal governing body's opposition to the proposed offshore wind projects in Yurok ancestral lands. Joining us now in the studio is Ken Bates from the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association. Thanks, Ken, for coming in.
James, thank you for allowing me to come in and get the opportunity to speak.
It's always a pleasure to talk to you. You know what you're talking about, and you are wired in. So thank you.
Yeah.
We're here mostly to talk about wind power this time around. We've had you on the show before. We've had you on a podcast. I enjoy every conversation we have.
Yeah.
But you've basically, sounds like, been dedicating the last several years of your life, the last year most intensively, to the wind power situation. And you're kind of a big deal in this process. You're on a 7-member working group. But I'll let you explain some of that. What's going on with the wind power project, and what's the perspective of the industry?
Yeah, just for people that don't know, Northern California has a really, really windy ocean. And the windiest areas on the ocean, especially on East Coast, would be the eastern side of the Pacific, or West Coast. Those are areas that generally have the highest production as far as fish and plankton and whales and all the just sea life. The wind is also the area that the wind power companies are looking at to site these various projects.
So that the richest parts of the ocean.
Yeah, that's correct. They just happen to overlap. Recently, we've been involved for about 2 or 3 years working with the California Energy Commission. The California Energy Commission is in the process of trying to determine what they refer to as sea space. And so sea space is an area that they think that they could use to lease out for additional wind power sites. So right now, where we are today, right this second, there are 5 leases in California. There's 3 in Central California, and then there's 2 off of Eureka. RWE Renewables and Vineyard Wind have those 2 lease sites. Those lease sites total about 600 square miles, all on fishing grounds. If the state is successful in converting over to a wind power, up to about, I think their goal is to have a big chunk of wind power by 2045. That's going to take an additional 4,000 square miles of fishing grounds. And most of that area will be north of Point Arena. And for your viewers that don't know where Point Arena is, it's 30 miles south of the town of Mendocino.
So, I mean, is it safe to say that what we're looking at now, or what's proposed now, is sort of a pilot project, but if it gets going and if this continues in that direction, it's going to expand a lot?
Yeah, and one of the things, and I'm glad you brought that up, because one of the things that fishermen's associations have been asking both the state and the federal governments is that these wind power projects in California right now be pilot projects, that they not go ahead and put out other lease areas in Oregon or Washington or California until the developers have actually had a chance to see if this stuff works, to give it a shot,
Yeah.
The problem with the sea space areas is that for floating offshore wind, they have to, even if it's quite deep, they have to have a bottom that's stable and smooth. They have to stay out of rocky areas. They can't be around canyons or big ocean, sub-ocean cliffs, things like that. Additionally, as these projects go down, we expect to lose another 1,000 square miles just to cable lanes, and that's the submarine cables that will export the electricity from the site to the beach. Right now there's talk about a potential cable from southern Oregon clear down to Monterey.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you can't fish over those, or you can't fish. How does that affect?
Yeah.
you?
So the way that generally works, cables are a little bit. There's a little bit of confusion. So cable installers and cable companies would ask fishermen with bottom contact gear, that could be longline gear, a trawler, crab gear. They ask that they give the cable route a half-mile berth. And that's because even though when the cables are installed and buried, there's a good chance that over time some of them will be subject to scouring and they'll be exposed.
Yeah.
So they'll ask you that you stay that far offshore, and nobody wants to lose their gear to a cable, And
That's a snag hazard.
It's a
right?
snag hazard. But even worse than that is that this country relies on submarine cables for all of its businesses and stuff. So that's one of the things there. Getting back to the loss of fishing grounds, the part of the concern is that if you were to take a map of California and a black felt pen and you colored in all the areas that were closed for one reason or another, Department of Defense, marine protected areas, national marine sanctuaries, cable lanes, all these different things that there's closures. Most of California's nearshore ocean would be black.
Yeah.
So when we lose these areas to fish in, what ends up happening is that everybody that's left fishing has to move to a different area.
Yeah.
And so there's a concern over long-term concentration of effort. There's a concern, nobody's going to actually going to be able to go into these, fishermen don't think that fishermen will be able to go in and work in these arrays of wind power turbines. They're talking about 200 turbines off the coast here. So those are kind of some of the things that we're concerned with. But the other thing is that, California's got the most restrictive fishing regulations kind of in the world, which is why we have fish and why we can go catch fish and why we can sell those fish. And so when we lose fishing grounds, what we are really losing is the ability to sustainably manage and harvest that fish in those areas. So ultimately the people that will lose out the most, it's not going to be fishermen, but it's going to be the consumer, because that fish is going to come from somewhere else.
Yeah, and that's hard to tell once it gets through the distribution system and everything else.
Yeah, I mean 85 to 90% of the fish consumed in the United States is imported.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one thing I wanted to point out to folks when we were talking about the season last year getting canceled and they're being limited to this year, you mentioned earlier that the fishermen actually voted to take the least amount of fish possible last year because they didn't want to be responsible or pegged as responsible for there being a depletion of the fishery.
Yeah.
I mean, that just demonstrates to me and hopefully to the audience that it's not like a rapacious attitude that the fishermen have. They're trying to be responsible but preserve at the same time what they're doing, right?
Yeah, and if you think about it for a second, I mean, I've been in Eureka for over 40 years, and I've watched the fishing industry and infrastructure shrink and shrink and shrink here. And damaging a fish population is the shortest term thinking on the planet. What we have done to salmon populations on the west coast of continental United States, is pretty huge. The dams and the water diversions, all those things. And somewhere along the line, if fishermen, like last year, fishermen decided, okay, we're not going to fish. We're just basically asked for zero option where there's no season, with the idea of just backing off and let everybody see that there's no fishing pressure. So where's the problem? And that's what we really have to, and that gets back to the climate change thing, renewable energy, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, well, and you made a point earlier that I want to make sure people hear that you guys have been in this process for a long time, years, trying to see this through as responsibly as possible. And also, you guys are not opposed to renewable projects.
Yeah.
It's just you want to make sure that since this is the only time these players are going to be at the table, that they make the concessions necessary to make this, as if it's going to go forward, as healthy as possible. Is that fair?
That's totally correct. We get one shot at this. This is it, and it's happening right now. Fishermen have been in meetings up here since 2018, and those meetings have been with Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, which used to be Mineral Management Services. We now call them BOEM, and then with all the state agencies. And a couple things that have happened over time is that we're continually, we'd have all the agency staff in the room, and somebody would say, well, here's a map, just point to where you fish. Just, is it right here or is it right here? And fishing isn't like that. Fishermen move with the fish. And so what ended up happening was Harrison Ibeck, the HFMA president, the local president here, he said, well, you know what, we're just gonna do our own mapping project. And when he said that, it was the most unpopular thing I've ever seen in a room full of agency people. There was not a smile anywhere. But what ended up happening is that Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association, Salmon Trollers Marketing Association in Fort Bragg, and the Crescent City Association signed a contractual agreement to figure out how to do mapping, and jumped through a bunch of hoops, got a $90,000 grant from Ocean Protection Council, which is a state agency, it's a cabinet level agency, and we did the first mapping of fishing grounds that's been done in continental United States.
I think we have some video of that. Sam, if we could see that video of the maps of the fishing, different fishing areas. Now, I mean, according to the information I was looking at on the map, it's broken up by different species, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, here we go. You can see
so you can go online and look at these maps. There's lots and lots of overlays on the maps.
Yeah, and you can click which ones you want to see. Yeah.
And so
the colors on the map right there represent different species.
Different species. Yeah. So the maps are based on, if somebody gave you a Dungeness crab pot, you could take these maps and go somewhere that the map shows and catch a crab. It might not be where everybody's fishing that week, but you could go there. Now, the other thing about mapping, and this is going to get us in the weeds for a minute, is that if an agency does it, or for instance, a college does it, something like that, there's the rule of three. And the rule of three states that if there aren't three fishermen fishing the same thing in the same area, then the agency or the academic agency cannot use their information, you know, for a data point. And so,
it's like to confirm?
well, part of it is because, you know, fishing has always been sort of somewhat protected, you know, as far as confidentiality. And so if there's not three guys fishing there, they can't use it. And we're fishermen. So what we were able to do is we were able to put in information on fishing that nobody else could access.
Yeah.
You know, because what makes a fishing industry, a community healthy, is lots of people doing different things.
Sure.
Yeah, so that was the deal.
And it also represents some exquisitely intimate knowledge, right? You
Yeah.
guys are out there working the waters and you're familiar with what's coming up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the next thing that happened as far as this project, when this project got done, at the same time we were having all these meetings, the other thing that the state agencies kept asking is that they said, you guys are so hard to get a hold of, we can never get a hold of you. We call, nobody answers the phone, you're on the boat, blah, 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 and we wish we had a point of contact. And George Bradshaw, fisherman in Crescent City, who's the president of Pacific Fishing, PCFFA, George said, well, you know, we're trying to figure out how to organize something. And so what ended up happening is that fishermen's associations in California formed a 501c6 nonprofit, which is the California Fishermen's Resiliency Association.
Okay. Which is what the organization you're a part of,
yeah,
director of.
That's right. And so that got formed. The initial funding for that was $10,000 that was passed through Humboldt Fishermen's Marketing Association from Redwood Coast Energy Authority.
Okay.
Because we've been working with Redwood Coast Energy Authority now since 2018. Okay. So they gave a short grant. We were able to turn that into a $100,000 a year grant from Ocean Protection Council.
Wow.
So the CFRA now has money for, it's got staff money, it's got money for travel. We have funds for hiring an attorney. We have a local attorney that's helped with some of the stuff. And so the CFRA has been tasked by the state with putting together a couple different products. There's a white paper, The Value of Fishing Grounds, that's been published. On our website there is all the different correspondence that's taken place between Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, the CFRA, and as well as the state stuff. And then,
what's the URL of your website?
Oh, it's long. It's California Fishermen's Resiliency Association.com.
Okay, well that's easy though.
Yeah, and the website right now it's rough, but we're in the process of having it overhauled by someone that knows way more than we do.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So one of the things that has happened though is that we have been tasked by the state. This organization is tasked by the state to come up with 2 contractual agreements. One of them would be between the fishing industry at large and the wind power, and the other one would be the fishing industry and the cable export deal. Yeah. And so these agreements are based on 3 things: avoidance, minimization, and mitigation. Yeah. And the first thing is avoidance. And I'm going to just quickly give you an example, a recent example of avoidance that just came up. Back in 2020, the Northwest National Laboratories up in Washington State decided to come down here with a very, very sophisticated weather buoy, and they were going to anchor it in the fishing grounds just outside of the wind power area. And in their press release that they planned to anchor this, they put the location, and they were going to anchor it with an 11,000-pound steel weight and then a whole bunch of giant chain. And at the end of their project, they were going to cut that stuff loose and leave it in the fishing grounds. So there's no boat that's a match for that kind of weight. You know, if a dragger hangs up its net, they're not going to get the net back. They could sink the boat. Yeah. So
that could actually sink the boat, though.
Yeah.
Because you get tangled up. And
tangled up in the cables. You get it's just bad weather. So the bottom line is, we asked that laboratory to retrieve the anchor gear, and they said our permit allows us to abandon it in place, and that's what they did. Recently, Axis Technologies, a Canadian company, is coming down here, and they're going to deploy yet another buoy. And we reached out to them, working with RWE Renewables, and we made the case to RWE, to Rick Robbins at RWE. He says, look, you can't just start leaving stuff all over the fishing grounds. You know, the ocean's not a junkyard. Yeah. And RWE worked with with Axis Technologies, and they changed their mooring system. And at the end of the year, when their project's over, they're going to pick all that stuff up. So that's how avoidance works.
Okay.
Avoidance also works in saying, we're not going to come in here with a 350-foot ship during the middle of crab season and start doing site survey work.
Yeah.
You know, so those are the kind of things, those are the first steps for fishermen and the fishing community to survive these projects.
Yeah.
And the
Getting involved in the process and on those three principles, basically keeping the problems from happening or addressing them if they do.
Yeah. And so those things have been going along. The CFRA has on our website, we have a list of impacts, and it's pages and pages and pages of things that could potentially happen. And one of the things that everybody has to understand is that while you might look at the newspaper or a cool brochure and all this stuff, you know, and it looks like everybody knows what's going on, nobody knows what's going on.
Sure.
The wind power guys don't know what's going on. They're still trying to figure out what equipment might work. There's things changing all the time. You know, a year ago, the biggest wind power turbine had a 300 by 300 by 300 foot triangular water line beam, and it was 850 feet tall. And now they're talking about one that's 400 feet and 1,100 feet tall.
Wow.
Yeah, and so like nobody knows what's happening. So part of the deal with this is that, you know, until people know where we're going, we don't even really know what questions to ask.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that brings us to the next thing. So one of the things that collectively this community was fortunate in having is Mike McGuire authored a bill, SB 286, and that bill basically was written to address some of these unknowns with wind power development in California and how they're going to relate to fishing and to coastal fishing communities. And out of that bill, along with a report from the Coastal Commission is required by law to do what's called a federal, let me think about this for a second, consistency determination report. So when the feds decided to have wind power leases off of Humboldt, the Coastal Commission came in and they made an extensive report. And it goes into great detail about fishing impacts. So between that report and Mike McGuire's work, there's now this 7C working group. And the 7C working group is fishermen. I think there's 7 or 8 fishermen on it. There's 3 tribal representatives. All the developers are there, and all the state agencies, and a couple federal agencies.
And you're on that board?
Yeah, I'm on it. Yeah, it's, you know, if you miss a meeting, you get voted president, you know. That's that kind of a thing. But so the thing that's going on there is that this group is tasked with putting together a statewide strategy for how we're going to operate these wind power projects.
Yeah. Now, so what are you hoping to see in that report? And then ultimately, what's next in the process after that's done?
So what we're hoping to see is we're hoping that the Coastal Commission will be able to use some of the work that the CFRA has done for, you know, like for instance, the contract templates, you know, that will go through a meat grinder once they get to the point, but that, and then an extensive policy that says, you know, it talks about avoidance, where we actually have things that we can do to avoid impacts.
Yeah.
You know, we'll talk about minimization. You know, well, if we got a survey, we won't do it this time, we'll do it at that time.
Yeah.
And then, you know, other things like, you know, mitigation. Mitigation's the last thing down the road.
Yeah.
You know, if we can't figure out anything else, you know, then we have to determine if there's a way to mitigate for it. And then if there's mitigation, how best, if there's mitigation funding, how best to use that for the greatest good for the longest time into the future.
Yeah.
It's not about paying somebody my age a check.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that's important to say, because a lot of people feel like in some way that this might be grifting or something for some kind of payoff, and that's not what's happening. And it's also interesting to me that it seems like you guys are carrying the water for a lot of what you would normally think of as environmental organizations in terms of protecting. I mean, you want to protect them because they're fishing grounds, but ultimately because you want to preserve the populations of fish. And the idea that people are going to be leaving vast chains and columns and stuff in the ocean because it's easier to do that than to remove them. Yeah. Those are environmental issues.
Well,
so you guys are doing a work that's more than just self-interested.
They are, but by the same token, what you have to remember, everything's a compromise and everybody has conflicts. Sure. So if you're an environmental group and you're trying to see that we're going to cut carbon emissions, you have to be in favor of this stuff. So you have to, you know, you're stuck. Yeah. You can't come out and just, pull your hair out.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we're looking at, though, is that, for instance, if indeed the state and the federal government is successful in putting wind power projects from Coos Bay, Central Oregon, down to Point Arena, that's 270 miles of energy extraction from the wind. Mm-hmm. It's not free. Yeah. And the wind that blows along the coast, like the wind we had yesterday, all that northwest wind we had, everybody's hair was messed up. That's responsible for driving the currents that cause upwelling. And upwelling is the bringing of cold bottom water up that's full of nutrients, and that kicks off plankton blooms, zooplankton blooms. Pretty soon the fish start to show up there, and that's why this coast is so productive. Yeah. There's only been one modeling study, and that was looking at the Central Coast wind energy areas that are in place right now, and looking at what they call downwind effects, leeward effects, and they expect to see a diminishing of upwelling from the Central Coast clear down to San Miguel Island below Point Conception. Wow. And that's just for those arrays. So there's a lot of things that we just have to find out, yeah. Which gets us back to some of the same things that the tribes are asking, is that we not go ahead and blanket this place with leases. Let's try it. Let's see if they can anchor these things out there. Let's make sure that they work. Plug them in, light up the lights before we do that. And fishermen have been asking for some baseline studies. So to go into an area, determine what's there beforehand, come back, in 5 years, look at it again, and as things get built out and operated, and see what's going on. Yeah.
We have about a minute left.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of territory.
Yeah.
There. Is there anything else that you want to restate or that you missed that you want to mention before we let people go?
I'm just glad to be able to come in and talk. I appreciate the invitation.
Yeah.
And it's a good way to get the word out. There are so many things going on in this world. It is really, really tough to stay on top of all of it. So
a lot of stuff going on in this world and a lot of issues. And like you were saying, there's conflicting motives and conflicting drives. And it's like, how do you make the right choices to do the right thing? What is right in those circumstances?
For me, I would just say, I live off the grid. I have 2 solar panels and a wind turbine. Yeah. We have 8 light bulbs in the house, a computer and a stereo, and I know how to run the vacuum cleaner.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's it.
And that's how we all should be living, right?
Honestly, I don't know. I can't say.
If we did, maybe we wouldn't have some of these problems.
That's right.
All right. Well, Ken, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you also.
And I'm sure we'll talk to you again.
Okay.
That's it for this evening. Thank you guys for joining us. Stay tuned. Stay informed.